In the last 7 days, we've seen one summit fail to come up with anything and another one called off before it even happened. Those Tomahawk missiles that we talked about here last week, they're not going to be going to Ukraine anytime soon after President Zelensky's frank and apparently very tense meeting with President Trump failed to achieve any breakthroughs. Shortly after we finished recording Tuesday's podcast, we then had news of that much talked about meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin that was due to happen in Budapest was being called off indefinitely. And then, on Wednesday evening, an announcement from the Trump administration. For the first time since he took office, the US announced new sanctions targeting Russia's two largest oil companies in an effort to pressure Moscow to negotiate a deal. He was asked by a reporter why he decided that now was the time.
I just felt it was time. We've waited a long time. I thought that we'd go long before the Middle East. Well, I think that in terms of honesty, the only thing I can say is every time I speak with Vladimir, I have good conversations, and then they don't go anywhere. They just don't go anywhere.
As always, plenty of you have been getting in touch with your questions about the war, and our team are here to answer them.
Hello, I'm Laura Gozzi.
Hello, I'm Paul Kirby.
Hi, I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
And I'm Lucy Hawkins. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
We've had lots of great questions from you, and we're going to get into them in a moment. But firstly, Vitaly, what a week we've had. Russian attacks on Ukraine really seem to have intensified. It's been a brutal week.
It certainly has been a brutal week. They're getting worse, especially targeting Ukraine's energy system. It's getting colder, it's getting darker. Russia's using it. But it's also hitting civilians as well. In a village outside Kyiv, 3 people were killed in a Russian drone strike. A mother, her 12-year-old daughter, and a 6-month-old girl as well. In Kharkiv, which is in Ukraine's northeast, Ukraine's second biggest city, a kindergarten was hit by Russia's Shahed drones. Not one, 3 Shahed drones hit one daycare facility. And those children, they escaped unscathed because they were in a bomb shelter. It's grim out there. And
just take one example of like Chernihiv. They've got no electricity at the moment.
Yes, the day before, on Monday, there was a massive strike on power stations supplying Chernihiv with electricity. Chernihiv is a fairly large city north of Kyiv, and completely blacked out, no power there.
And Paul, what's happened with the meeting, the Budapest meeting that they seem so excited about?
Extraordinary. There was a lot of excitement for several days. Everyone thought after the 2.5-hour phone call, there was going to be a summit in Budapest. First of all, we were trying to work out how is Putin going to get to Budapest? That was all the interest. Then things begin to fall apart rather quickly in a way that they fell apart slowly after the Alaska summit. It turned out that the Russians were going a bit cold on it, and Lavrov was essentially saying, well, nothing was planned anyway, so how can you postpone something that actually hasn't been scheduled? And eventually it just began to fall apart, and Trump said it was going to be within 2 weeks, and now we don't think it's going to happen at all.
And do you think it was frustration around that, Laura, that led to Trump then saying he's going to slap these sanctions on Russia?
I think possibly. I mean, I think Trump has been trying to solve this for some time now. I think he's getting increasingly frustrated at how intractable Moscow seems to be on many points around a potential ceasefire or peace deal. And so, yes, I think now he's trying to show that, him losing patience actually means something, actually has real world consequences for Russia.
In terms of President Zelensky, he's on a big diplomatic tour this week. He's been in Scandinavia, he's in Brussels, coming to London as well. And we've had some questions around some of the language he's been using, and we're going to get to those in a minute. But first, let's talk about these new sanctions from the US. And we've had this question in from Finian in Liverpool.
Hello, Ukrainecast. It's Finian from Liverpool. Donald Trump has finally taken some action against Putin as a result of his unwillingness to find a peaceful settlement. How much difference do these additional sanctions really make to Russia, both versus what's been imposed previously and versus what more could be directly implemented by the US?
Yes, these sanctions, they are harder biting than most of the others because they target Russia's two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. They are absolutely huge, 3.1 million barrels of oil per day. Now, the biggest question I have about this is that whether this is going to change anything, actually. And this is a question we keep coming back to when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, and all the efforts that America and Europe are taking. And the reason why we have to ask this question in this case is because 80% of Russian crude oil is being bought by two countries, India and China. Whether they're going to listen, whether they're going to take account of these sanctions is another matter. Is China going to ignore it, in which case they will be pretty much meaningless?
I mean, it does feel, Paul, like India would take more note than China.
Exactly. Now, as you say, India is one of the two big countries. India has already had secondary tariffs slapped on them by Trump. So India is sitting up and taking notice, and this is probably why the oil price has gone up ever since Trump made this announcement. Then we have the whole idea of it's not just the economic impact, it's the symbolic impact, because it's the first time that Trump has actually done anything in this respect. This is the first direct action he's taken in terms of sanctions. And they came from Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, but they also came a week after the UK imposed identical sanctions. So it was almost as if the two countries were in lockstep. And so you begin to think, well, maybe something has moved on this front.
So other things are happening in Russia at the moment. And we've had this question in from Melissa in Buffalo, New York, who says, I just heard that Russia is conducting nuclear drills today. Can you describe more about what this might entail? And I think Vitaly, Melissa asks, because every time you hear about anything to do with nuclear, it can be very worrying for people.
It can be, but we need to remember that this is what Russia does. It rattles its sabers. It shows off its nuclear arsenal. And the reason why this is happening is because nuclear weapons largely exist not to be used against your enemy in practice, but they're used as a deterrent. The very fact that countries have them is supposed to stop their enemies from taking meaningful action. So this is what happened in Russia as well. It showed off various videos showing missiles being launched from submarines, from the ground, and Vladimir Putin was involved. And the message was, be afraid. We can use nuclear weapons against you. Whether they will is an entirely different question, Melissa.
And we should always remember, Laura, as well, NATO conducts nuclear deterrent exercises as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it often does. It's not unusual, but as Vitaly was pointing out, it's the timing and what you want to read into the timing that is of the essence here, I think.
So many of you are interested, and it's time to get to the ongoing negotiations and the kind of tone that we're hearing as well from President Zelensky, when there's been any shift there, what he's talking to European leaders about as well. But Sasha on Discord has said Trump has had another falling out with President Zelensky last week, and now he's talking about freezing the front lines as they are, and everyone can just go home. Does anyone really think he's serious when he says that, and will it work? The Gaza ceasefire seemed to last 5 minutes before killings started again. Paul, that is the tone that we're getting from President Trump, that, everyone they just need to agree and everyone can go home. What are we hearing from President Zelensky?
Right. So this, I think, has been Zelensky's point all along, that we need a ceasefire. The question is really, how are you going to bring a ceasefire about? Is it going to be along the line of contact, the front line as existing? Because that seems to be the only possible way you can have a ceasefire. And I don't think that Zelensky's tone has changed at all over months. I think we can say that Zelensky is basically saying this all along.
Has it changed, Vitaly? I mean, this line of contact phrase, it keeps coming up every day.
It does, but when we're talking about ceasefire, we need to remember, where else do you cease your fire? It's along the line of contact. And President Zelensky, he was speaking in Sweden yesterday and Wednesday, and he specifically said, we are prepared to engage in diplomacy, but not at the cost of withdrawing from territories we currently
no
control.
concessions.
So I don't think he is signalling any readiness to make concessions. However, over the past months, he's been talking about discussing the territorial issue, whether or not it means that Ukraine is now being pressured by its allies to accept relinquishing control of those, or acknowledging that Russia is in charge of those territories for some time or forever. That seems to be what's going on.
What about the Russian perspective, Laura? Because President Zelensky does keep saying that, he's prepared to stop at the current front lines. He said that would be a good compromise. But even he said yesterday, I don't think Putin will accept that.
Well, I mean, one of the goals of this war, as stated by Putin and other Kremlin officials over and over, is that they want to take full control of the two regions that collectively are called the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. I mean, they even annexed them through referendums that weren't really recognised by anybody but themselves. But the point is that Putin has never backed away from this idea of seizing the two regions in full. Now, this is a problem for Zelensky because, if nothing else, I mean, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have fought to protect these regions. So the idea of giving them up is very problematic. And also because Zelensky has always said, those are regions that one day, if we gave them to Russia, Russia could use as a springboard to attack us again. So, I mean, there's such a gulf between Ukraine and Russia on this and many other things that at the moment, I mean, I'm not surprised that all discussions are focusing on this, especially because it's so contentious.
We have a great question, and actually from Ian as well, who is asking about the political capital and how President Zelensky stands in Ukraine right now.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Ian from London. How much political capital does Zelensky currently hold in Ukraine? Could he convince the Rada to give up any territories as part of a concession for peace? Thank you.
President Zelensky still wields a lot of influence in Ukraine. I've looked at the latest opinion polls, and his support rating is somewhere in the region of 60%, which is more or less unchanged since early summer this year. So when it comes to what he will be able potentially to do to give up territory, I think it's a non-starter, really. So first, it's not up to the Rada or the Ukrainian parliament. It's up to the people, because any changes to Ukraine's borders will have to be put to a referendum. And Ukrainian law says no votes, no referendums can take place as soon as martial law is in place. And also, if we think back to when Ukraine was initially attacked by Russia in 2014, and what happened later in 2022 when Ukraine was openly attacked by Russia, it was the Ukrainian people who organized themselves into volunteer battalions to defend their land. So if suddenly Zelensky were to be pressured into giving up territory, would Ukrainians accept it? That's a big question. And also, when politicians in various capitals talk about Ukraine giving up land, people live there. People still live there. So those families, they'll be left behind enemy lines. They'll lose their everything, possibly their lives, given that Russia has shown incredible cruelty in targeting Ukrainians who are still present in occupied territories. So the key point here is that when we hear all these suggestions and ideas coming from Washington, European capitals, the 12-point plan, none of this is going to work until these politicians decide what exactly they will be prepared to do to make Russia accept those plans. Because currently, they've not done much to make Vladimir Putin change his plan at all.
And Paul, obviously in Europe, they're worried too that this would set a really dangerous precedent if you let Russia.
And I think Laura mentioned that the fact that they could be used as a springboard if they hand territory to the Russians. But what we were just saying now, this is really interesting, Vitaly, it refers back to the previous question as well about territory. And I think Trump has had to find out the hard way from Zelensky over a period, especially since August, that actually you can't just hand back the territory. Zelensky has not got that power. He said the other day that, and I think he's right, that 78% of Donetsk region, which is the other part of Luhansk and Donbass, is pretty much all, 99%, in Russian hands. But 78%, he's beginning to understand, Trump, that this is not something that's negotiable. You can't just hand back 22%, the other 22% of Donetsk, because there are so many cities, there are so many civilians living there, and you really want to create another humanitarian crisis?
Well, we've got a question here about European countries, most of which, of course, are Ukraine's allies, continuing to boost the Russian economy by buying its gas. And this question comes from Chile, from Alejandro, and we think you might be our first Ukrainecast listener, Alejandro, to get in touch with us from Chile. So thank you so much for writing in. He asks, could the US impose tariffs on individual EU countries for buying Russian goods, or would it have to be on the whole EU bloc? And are there lawful ways to permanently expropriate frozen Russian assets or otherwise deny future compensation to deter such trade? Laura.
Well, this issue is probably being discussed as we speak in Brussels. This idea that that European financial institutions hold so much Russian money and that it can't be touched, it's something that European lawmakers have been trying to get around for quite some time now. So this system, well, this proposal that they've come up with and that they're discussing today, basically involves the EU borrowing the Russian money that's being held by a financial institution in Brussels and giving it to Ukraine, but replacing it with a sort of IOU that would be backed by all member states. Now, Ukraine would be spending that money now because it needs it badly. It amounts to 140 billion, which would maybe cover its expenses for a couple of years and no more. But that's a problem for the future. But in the meantime, the idea is that Russia one day, if and when the war ends, would then be paying Ukraine reparations back. And then only at that point would it get its assets back. So it's very complex. Russia doesn't like this idea at all. The Russian ambassador to Italy, I think, referred to it as the theft of the century. And it's being discussed, and the European Commission would then have to work out the legal framework, and it wouldn't come into force until early next year. But it would be pretty momentous because it's not something that's been done before. And it's ambitious, it's contentious, not everyone's going to like it, but we'll see if it actually comes about.
Laura's had some intense time getting her head around this, Paul.
Yes, it's an extremely complex instrument.
But it does feel like most European countries are on board.
That's the interesting thing. And by the way, it made us laugh a little bit when the ambassador to Italy came out with that comment in the week of the Louvre theft of 88 million euros worth of jewels. But yes, in terms of getting the European Union to agree something, so contentious as this has been quite something. It's taken months and months, and this has come to a head right now because countries as important as Germany have swung behind it. Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, very recently decided, you know what, this is a good idea and we can back it. The most important country, of course, is Belgium in this instance, because this is where the institution that holds the Russian assets, Euroclear, is based. And if Belgium can be convinced, and the door has been pushing that way for a few days, it looks as if they are agreeing it, then the rest of the European Union, although they have reservations, will probably swing past it.
We often get questions, of course, on strategy, and Ukrainians right now dealing with the aftermath of these strikes, as Vitaly was saying, on some of their key infrastructure, particularly when it comes to energy and electricity. Peter has asked us a question. Now that Ukraine has the Flamingo and Neptune long-range missiles, why is it not taking out power stations for Moscow and St. Petersburg and other utilities like water? They've done it to Ukraine and much worse. Vitaly.
I think there are two possible answers to that question. One is that they can't because Russian air defenses are so good. And the other answer is that because they not want to, because that would portray Ukraine in a completely different way as a country that is prepared to harm Russian civilians as winter approaches. This is what Russia has been criticized for its attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. So for Ukraine to be doing the same thing, that's a political risk.
So the imperative for Ukraine is to target things that fuel the war machine directly.
Which is mostly oil refineries, oil storage facilities, and that has been reasonably successful.
But I think the oil refineries are also hitting home. Hitting the oil refineries means that civilians are being affected because petrol prices are going up. There are 20% shortages. So those are actually targeting civilians in their own right, even if indirectly. I think another point about the Flamingos and the Neptunes is that just maybe they're not ready yet, because yes, there's been some talk of Neptunes being used on short levels, short range, for example, just over the border into Bryansk and so on. But in terms of closer to St. Petersburg or Moscow, they've been using drones very effectively so far. And maybe they don't want to use the Flamingos and Neptunes until they're really ready.
Paul, I wonder what you think in terms of the next few days. And it's been quite a busy week again for President Zelensky on the sort of diplomatic tour, but then the developments out of the White House with the sanctions, the discussion we've had around the narrative, but also the language that's being used. Do you think by the end of the weekend things might have actually changed? Will they have moved on?
I feel that we've gone around and round in circles, and we've done this since August, and I don't feel we've got anywhere. Every time somebody suggests something, like Trump suggests we're going to get somewhere, we're going to have talks, and they haven't abandoned the idea of talks, it feels like we just go back into reverse and we end up with nothing. And I remember listening to a Ukrainian MP just this week saying, I don't want to get optimistic because everybody's talking about the possibility that something might move in the right direction in terms of the end of the war. But the truth is, I don't want to get optimistic because I just have a dreadful feeling that it's all going to go back to where we were at the start.
I think personally, having followed this story for quite some time, I think what's really obvious is that, there can be so much talk of talks, talk of sanctions and all the rest of it. But I think what we keep coming up against is a very intractable stance by Moscow. A lot of words are thrown around, but the only messaging that doesn't really change is the Kremlin's. They want certain things. They've wanted the same things since the beginning. They've sometimes dressed them up as a bit different, but not really. And so they've actually been very consistent in their goals and aims. And we keep coming up against the same problem because they just won't budge on that. And I think there is something to what Zelensky was saying earlier this week when, he was talking about how Russia won't really engage in diplomacy. He was referring to the issue of front lines especially. And he was like, actually, the only thing that made Russia pay attention was, the Tomahawks, the long-range missiles. That's when Putin picked up the phone and had this unscheduled call with Trump last Thursday. So whether this message is something that's beginning to trickle through.
Yes, there's no Tomahawks.
No, there's no Tomahawks, but, there might be something else down the line or not. I'm sure that whatever does come about will be preceded by weeks of back and forth again.
And we will be here for all of those questions. Thank you all very much. And thank you for watching. We will have another Q&A episode next week. In the meantime, don't forget you can check out our Ukrainecast feed. Plenty more analysis there for you on all the key moments of the war, including big interviews with people and players on the ground as well. If you like the sound of that, just search for Ukrainecast wherever you get your BBC podcasts and make sure you subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Bye for now.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.